want to do is try to understand and kind of conceptualize the earliest expression of religion. So the earliest formation, in what form, in what context did it take? So we're going to look at the kind of theories that have been put forward related to the origin of religion. Now, in order to achieve that goal of trying to understand the origin or the earliest expression of religion, we need to draw upon anthropology. Now, why perhaps do we need to draw upon anthropology? Yeah.
Because if we're studying the origin of religion, we're going to study why humans kind of made it in the first place and how it was made, so it kind of basically stuff around humans.
Yeah, so if we look at the focal point of anthropology generally, it tries to understand the formation of culture and how we ascribe and assign meaning. So it's a study of different societal and cultural formation. While we said last week, that sociologists want to explore society or study and understand society and its function. So invariably, if we want to look at the origin of religion, there's going to be overlap between anthropology, which we're going to draw from, and sociology, which we're going to draw from. Now, before we kind of look at some points, there is a bit of a disclaimer. Now, some of the anthropologists and sociologists that we will be looking at this week, in particular, are kind of 19th, 20th century theorists. So some of the terminology that they use, say for example primitive to describe the other, or lower culture or lesser culture, these are all problematic terms that essentially originate from their method that they used or their approach, which was the evolutionary approach. Now, why is using the evolutionary approach slightly problematic when you want to study societies and cultures? So if we look at it, the problem with these theorists adopting the evolutionary approach is that they're Western-centric. They're based in the West, and their mindset has been established and extracted from the West. Now, the problem with the evolutionary approach is essentially the goal of it was to create distinctions between Western culture and other cultures. Now, often this was done with the Western bias to show that Western civilization, Western culture, Western religion was more sophisticated and more rational, while other cultures were basically perceived as lesser and primitive and therefore irrational. So that kind of evolutionary approach skews the understanding of culture and societies. So obviously some of these theorists use terminologies that we wouldn't really use in the 21st century when we're describing the other. Okay, now, are there any questions on that? Okay, so in terms of what Durkheim is saying here, now he makes two very important points about the origin of religion. Now, the first thing he says is that if you want to explore the origins of religion, then you need to kind of identify the ever-present features or the ever-present causes that existed within the origin of religion. So he basically says you can go back to the early societies and you'll have certain established ever-present features. You can look basically in the 18th, 19th or 20th century when a lot of these anthropologists and sociologists, they studied different tribes and societies and cultures in their time frame. And you have the modern. And what he's basically asserting is that whether you go back to the first or the earliest formation of religion, or his time frame, or even in the modern, you will have ever-present features. Hey, you can grab lecture slides there. There are always ever-present features related to kind of that exist about religion. So the question then is, okay, what are the ever-present features that existed in the first formation of religion, the 20th century or the 19th century, and still exist today? Because that's what he's asserting, that there are certain ever-present features in religion that existed in the early religion, even they persist today in the modern. So what are those features? Yeah.
Community.
So there is an element of community, yes, that collective kind of identity that perhaps is drawn from religion. What else? You kind of put your hands up both together. Go on.
So like a sense of a higher power.
So a sense or a recognition of a higher power.
I was going to say spirituality.
Okay, spirituality. So if we look at, according to Durkheim, and we are going to look at this in a couple of slides down the line, for Durkheim, he asserts that whether it's the early tribe, let's say, that formed religion, well, what was it? For him, soon as that collective group recognized something as sacred, i.e. they set it apart from every other thing. So basically Durkheim, as we're going to discover, he felt totemism was the first religious expression. Now in totemism, what happens is you have a clan or a tribe and they recognize a sacred object or thing as the totem of the clan. So take, for example, let's just say hypothetically, a Native American tribe identifies the crow as their particular totem. Now that totem, that crow, now is basically considered sacred. So their behavior, their relationship to that object changes according to the value that they imbue that thing with. We will explain that a little bit more. So that existed according to Durkheim. So this is what he talks about as the distinction between the sacred and the profane, or the sacred and the everyday. And that existed in tribes that he observed in the 19th, 20th century. But even today in the modern, walk down the high street and we have examples of that ever-present feature of the sacred and the profane. How? Where?
Flags.
So flags could be, yes.
Like technology and like phones, and people cry things their phone.
So if we look at it, there are abundant examples. Let's just go to the basic one. This silly drawing, here's a church and here's a Tesco. From their physical construct, they are identical, meaning you need the same exact raw materials to build a church and the Tesco's, brick, concrete, whatever, yeah? So physically, they are the exact same construct, they are the exact same thing. But what is different is we as a society give value to these things differently. So the church is considered sacred, while the Tesco's is the profane, the everyday. That's where we go and do our supermarket. So our relationship to a church, how we behave in the church, is different to the Tesco's. And that is a collectively agreed value that we bestow upon that object. So again, by making those distinctions in our social reality, we create religion. We're creating the sacred and the profane. We're creating distinctions. And the distinctions are what Durkheim suggests as those perhaps ever-present features. Now, the second point that he talks about is the idea that these ever-present features in his 19th, 20th century period, he felt that if you went and studied, obviously problematic language, these lower cultures in the 19th, 20th century, they would give you a better understanding of the origin of religion. Now, why is that?
Less developed.
So less developed and less contact with Western modernity to become contaminated. So in some ways what he felt is that it was more kind of, it gives you a glimpse into perhaps the earliest expressions of religion. Okay, let's move on. So another point, before we do eventually touch on the theories, is this idea of intrinsic religiousness. Any idea what we mean here by intrinsic religiousness? So some theologians have asserted that the reason why we have religion and the reason why religion originated in the first place and the reason why religion never died after the Enlightenment is because religion is part of our intrinsic kind of DNA. So what they suggest is that God imbued the human agent with fixed instincts: survival, procreation, worship. And in particular, it is this supposed worship instinct that is intrinsic to the human construct that pushes the human being to seek out God or the divine, to basically worship something beyond us, to seek out answers to the fundamental questions of why are we here, how did we get here, where are we going. So they assert that this basic kind of God gene is intrinsic to the humans. That's why human beings in their earliest formation, when they saw something in awe, they needed to revere it, they needed to worship it. And so that was just something intrinsic to them. How might a sociologist respond to that?
That it isn't innate to human condition, it's just sort of psychology that made us sort of try and explain the unknown. If we want to explain anything, because we want to explain the unknown, we give it a sort of divine thing, but then society builds around it because it's so holy. It's not because it's innate within us.
Okay, no, good point. So it's true. So essentially, look, if you want to try to equate religion to some kind of instinct, well, if you look at it, human beings actually have just a singular one instinct, which is survival. Survival is our principal instinct that makes us navigate the natural world. It's the thing that pushes us to run away from risk, or it also pushes us to seek out opportunities in nature. Survival is that thing that drives us, and procreation is just a subset of survival, because if we don't procreate the species or perpetuate the species, then we die. So it's a need, survive, we have to basically reproduce to continue to live. So what we're trying to say then is there is no intrinsic aspect of religiousness in the human agent from the instinctual perspective. All that happens possibly is that we have the survival instinct, and because survival is our kind of connection point with nature, we respond to nature, and ultimately there are things in nature, talking about early societies, that we fear that agitate the survival instinct. And because there's elements we don't know, we then imbue it with divinity. So what we need to understand is religiosity is not intrinsic, it's not coming from within us, it's a social construct that we create from outside of ourselves. So it's not a natural thing, religion, it's a socially constructed thing. But that's what we're going to kind of dwell on. Is there any questions so far? Cool. Okay, next point that is actually an important point. We need to actually understand the boundaries post-Enlightenment that have been created between science, magic, and religion. So we live obviously in a post-Enlightenment world where there is clear boundaries between science and religion, and magic has pretty much disappeared. Now, let's kind of reflect on that. So, okay, let's first look at the perspective from science. What is science? Science's focus, as we know, is the natural world, all right? But what is the purpose? What is the actual function of science? What is it designed to do?
It's supposed to explain the world in our way.
So it's designed to basically provide us knowledge so that we can manipulate nature for human benefit. So in essence, it's about creating efficiency and making our life easier. So no one wants to sweep the floor with a broom. If you have a Hoover, it makes it easier. So it's about manipulating and gaining knowledge of nature so that we can manipulate it for our benefit. So it's human-centered. It's focused on worldly outcomes. Now, religion then, as we know, especially post-Enlightenment, the domain of religion is the supernatural. So science occupies the physical world. Basically, what happens in the physical universe, science explains. But what came before, what lies after, is perhaps the domain of religion, because religion asks, you know, what was before? Obviously, we have our life, and then we have death. And religion asserts that obviously there is an after, And this is the whole kind of focus of religion. Religion's focus is the afterlife. It might try to create an alignment between the afterlife and this life. What do we mean by that? Creating an alignment with this life and the afterlife. So in essence, to gain redemption, salvation, or whatever in the afterlife, we might have to adopt a set of beliefs and behave a particular way. So we have to live our life in a way that determines what happens in the next life. So there is an alignment. But for now, the point is, religion's domain, as we know, is the supernatural. Now we come to magic. Now magic interrelates these two worlds. So how does it interrelate both worlds? So magic, if you look at the functionality of magic, magic wants to basically manipulate the natural world for human benefit. That sounds familiar, right? So that sounds like science. But how it does it is it harnesses or seeks to harness the power of the supernatural. Harness the power of the supernatural, direct it to the natural world for human benefit. So if your crops aren't growing, then you can get perhaps a stone that is imbued with, say, manna, and try to put it on your crops. That is the magic of transference. You're trying to gain something from the supernatural realm. You're trying to harness that power from the supernatural and direct it to your crops so that they grow. So again, magic interrelates. It's about trying to gain betterment for humans in the physical world while relying upon supernatural power or forces. So why is this all important then? So like I said, post-Enlightenment, we adopted science. Science said to determine truth, you have to use sense perception and what we can prove physically that exists, that can be tested, that is truth. So science took complete domain of the physical universe and created boundaries of separation where science has the physical and religion has the supernatural. The problem then is magic, because magic encroaches upon religion and science, because it's trying to kind of be that bridge. So what we find though is that before the Enlightenment, there is no separation between science, magic and religion. So if we go back to civilizations like the Egyptians in particular, Egyptian priests had a very good understanding of human biology, anatomy, how the body works and the organs. They had a scientific understanding of the body. But they also had beliefs in how the kind of reality is structured, the divinities. But they also as well were trying to kind of use magic as well to enhance people and so forth. So this was not, like obviously how we see it today is separate spheres, separate boundaries. This is not how it existed before the Enlightenment. So in many ways, this distorts kind of the understanding. Are there any questions on that? Okay, so just quickly now to look at the timeline to understand the kind of certain key points related to the development and formation of religion. So if we look at this timeline, this is based on archaeological evidence. 130,000 years ago, we see perhaps some evidence of ritualistic burial during the Middle Paleolithic period. What does that tell us? That there were perhaps ritualistic burial over 130,000 years ago. That's perhaps even just as Homo sapiens were coming about. So what does that indicate? Yeah.
We just not to care about what happens after someone dies, because we just saw it as purely, I suppose, monistic
Yeah.
thing as well. We wouldn't care about the corpse of someone, because we wouldn't care about almost like their safe passage.
Okay, so there is that element. So okay, there are two potential perspectives here. There is perhaps some early distinction between the physical, the living, and the dead. And perhaps there is some ritual around that. What early archaeologists found is that they found in certain early caves that date back 130,000 years, they found that early humans basically put their dead there, but what they found was different nectar seeds from many different plants, which did not obviously grow in the cave. So that suggests that they had laid different flowers and performed rituals, perhaps, around the dead. And this was found at different sites. So it seems it is a kind of ritual of mourning, possibly. So there is some signs that there's definitely mourning rituals, as well as perhaps possibly some realization of a distinction between life and death. Then we'll jump it because we're going a little bit slow. 40,000 years ago, we find the discovery of Venus figurines. Why are these perhaps important? What do they suggest? So a lot of these Venus figurines were discovered around farming communities, or people that basically had crops and things like that, as well as obviously individual kind of family structures. So what we see from obviously Venus figurines is again the possibility of transference related to magic and those aspects. Now, quickly, I know we talked about it last time. 11,000 years ago, we had the Neolithic period where we had that kind of social transformation, where the human beings underwent that evolution, kind of that evolutionary shift from tribal societies, nomadic societies, to settled. Now, what's important to understand from that perspective is that that distinguishes two types of societies. The settled, and let's just say the nomadic, or whatever we want to call it. Now, if we're looking at the origin of religion, it's basically in these early societies that we see the earliest expressions of religion, whether as a meaning system or whatever. When we talk about the settled, we're talking about more organized religion. So here, religion becomes more structured, organized, as we talked about last time, right? So as long as we're aware of that distinction. Are there any questions before we eventually move to the first theory? Okay, so the first theory put forward related to the origin or the earliest expression of religion is put forward by the British sociologist, anthropologist Spencer. Now he says the origins of religion lay in the worship of spirits, ghosts. How is that possible, that our first religion relates to the recognition of spirit and ghosts? So what he suggests is that you have the early tribe, the early clan, and obviously you have members of the clan. Now what happens is one member of the clan dies, yeah? So that person dies, their physical essence is buried or whatever, but then what happens is a couple of days later, this person reappears to other members in the tribe. Not in physical form, but in non-physical form within their dreams. So now this tribe is trying to work out, well, who did I encounter? You know, such and such died, yeah? But now I have re-encountered them in a non-physical form. So what this starts to create is a distinction between the physical and the non-physical, the living and the dead. And basically within dreams, dreams are essentially this kind of separate reality that isn't bound by nature. So in essence, in dreams, when we dream, we can encounter the spirits or the ghosts. So in essence, what he's arguing is that because our early ancestors, they had those dreams of dead ancestors, that created the first duality that we have. Because religion ultimately is built on some form of duality. That you have basically the dead and the living, or the physical and the non-physical. The non-physical being spirits and ghosts in this case. So because they create that distinction, that then creates, that's the first kind of spark of religious belief. That's the first kind of explanation. Then from that are going to come ceremonies and rituals and other things. Now, it's worth noting when it comes to Spencer, we need to reflect on his method. So Spencer's methodology is highly problematic. He never went to the field. He never studied tribes in their actual environment, in their natural setting. Rather, he sat in his study in London and used what he called introspection to try to place himself into the mindset of, as he described it, a primitive. And so this is how he basically deduced his ideas, that basically he could basically work out what they think. Now, what's the problem with that? Obviously, you've got someone who is, Western-centric tradition, culture, religion, trying to erase that and trying to place himself into the reality, the social reality of someone he's never seen, experienced, met. So it's near to impossible to try to do that. It's just all basically hypothetical introspection. So his method is problematic. His last point, though, is that however primitive people are, primitive people are not irrational. They make inferences on very limited knowledge. What does that mean? Sorry, you're going to have a question about something else.
I just want to, was he wrong with that? So that his method may have been a little bit convoluted, but was he wrong?
Well, we're going to look at the next slide at an example that might suggest, there is an element of possibility in his theory, even though his methodology is dubious. So, what's he saying here? Primitive people are not irrational. So he's not necessarily saying, look, they're not irrational, but they're just lacking knowledge. So they don't understand that dreams are perhaps imagination. They basically deem that imagination is some kind of spirit world. So because our knowledge of our unconscious state has developed a bit more, they don't have that knowledge. So based on the limited knowledge they have, this is what is rational to them. So he's not necessarily saying that they're irrational. Okay, let's look at it as an example then. So we have the tribe, the Dungondani. They're an interesting tribe because what they believe is they believe in the Morgat. The Morgat is basically a spirit that dwells within all human beings. Now, these spirits dwell in human beings, and they're the thing that that we perceive in dreams. Now, the problem is when someone dies, if they are not basically put to rest and rituals are not performed, then that basically spirit can escape. And when that spirit escapes and wanders the natural world, that spirit is the reason why we have famine, death, and disease. So according to them, and this is why the Dungondani have very complex rituals when it comes to death ceremonies. They have to perform a lot of rituals like the ghost house. You have to basically try to capture the spirit before it can escape once the person has died. So there is all of this kind of ritual related to containing the spirit so that it doesn't wander the natural world and cause destruction. What's interesting is how Haider describes some aspects of this. So he says in his book on the Dungondani, he says, cultures develop rituals around those areas of life that are most uncertain. What does he mean here? So obviously, for example, this tribe, the things that kind of impact them the most, the greatest uncertainties that they have are things like death, disease, illness, right? These are the things that they encounter, those famine and other things, constantly, related to their survival. So invariably, if these are the biggest concerns that they have, these are the things that they have most uncertainty about, then invariably you're going to construct your beliefs and rituals to kind of explain them. So for example, the fact that the Dungondani believe that if you don't capture the Morgat, it will basically wander the natural world and cause disease and death. So you have to contain it. It explains why illness occurs. It explains why bad things occur. So it's an explanation for natural phenomenon, social phenomenon. And so ultimately, tribes will focus on these big problems that they encounter, and their religion is an attempt to resolve that. Are there any questions on that? Cool. Okay, so the second theory is proposed by Tyler in his book Primitive Culture. Now he asserts that animism, which he described as the general doctrine of souls and other spiritual beings in general, which includes an idea of pervading life and will in nature. What is animism? So in its absolute simplest sense, animism is the universality of the soul. So what it suggests is that human beings, we looked upon nature and ourselves and imbued all objects with some kind of life-giving force within it. So a spirit, a god, a divinity, it basically functions to animate the object. So basically, you know, the tree, the mountain, the sun, yeah? These things that we find in nature have a physical component, the branches, the leaves, but there is also a spiritual component that is that life-giving component to that object. So in essence, the soul is the thing that is the life energy within the tree, the mountain, or the sun. Okay? Now, this all then relates to the fact that basically, why does the sun go up? Why does the sun go down? Why does the sun cause famine? Why is it, you know, all of these things? We imbue it with agency. So there had to be some kind of source or that makes it go up and down, that controls it. So animism is really about imbuing all things in nature with some kind of animating force. And that animating force exists within us as well as on those natural things. So this is considered for Tyler the first religious thought. That basically we created this kind of religion of animism based on that distinction between physical, non-physical. That there is the physical shell, but there has to be some kind of spiritual or supernatural component that gives us agency or gives us animation. Okay, so looking at that from an example perspective. So last week I think we touched on the Inuit through an example of Arctic hunting. What's interesting about the Inuit and Arctic hunting is actually this statement that they have, which states the great peril of our existence lies in the fact that our diet consists entirely of souls. What does that mean? So if we look at Arctic hunting is not just a materialistic act. It is a material act that obviously, yes, you hunt, you kill an animal, you consume it, your community consumes it. There is a material aspect linked to survival, but the whole act is actually also spiritual. How is it spiritual? Yeah.
Because you're consuming the souls of the beings, and you eat and you're sustained, and that sustaining is on a physical level that we understand, but to them it's on a spiritual level too.
Yes. So basically, when we consume that seal, whale, or whatever, firstly, by the process of killing it, you release that soul back out into nature. So in essence, it's not seen as contradictory, it's basically the need to survive and kind of alignment with their worldview. And this view that the Inuit had, especially previously, was very much animistic, that everything in nature has a soul. So you treat that thing with a degree of kind of respect because it's a living thing that has some animating force behind it. So even though, you know, the killing of an animal, it is kind of materialistic as well as ritualistic and spiritual. That's what, yeah, sorry.
Does that imply that there's an element of guilt involved in them, basically surviving?
Yeah, obviously you have the belief, which is all things are sacred because they are imbued with spirit or a soul, and so when you go and kill, obviously their mythology explains and justifies the act. So it takes the act that you might feel guilty about, the materialist act of killing an animal, but renders it essentially just because it's connected to the physical and the spiritual, that basically you're releasing it back into nature. But I get your point. Okay, another example that we need to touch on when we're looking at animism is perhaps the formation, or the earliest formation of religion within Japan, namely around Shinto, or early Shinto. So what we see in Japan is still to this day the persistence of supernatural entities known as the kami. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but the kami can be non-physical entities, and they can be physical entities that are spirit beings, right? But what we need to understand is the kami occupy nature. They reside in a waterfall, they reside in a mountain. So they exist within nature. Now, a thing that we haven't mentioned thus far when we're talking about the theory of religion is an important aspect to why religion perhaps formed, and that is the concept of utility. Some theorists suggest utility is the central reason why perhaps we have religion. What do we mean by that? So let's take the formation of gods, or kami, and their worship in Japan. So as we know, Japan is obviously an island. Yeah, terrible example, but drawing. So what we have here are two arrows. And these two arrows, the red arrows, we see two interesting phenomena. So we see on the coast of Japan, by the sea, there are different gods worshipped to basically gods around farming. So rice farmers don't worship the same kami as each other. So what does this tell us? What gods or kami are worshipped by the sea or amongst fishermen?
There's people who live by the sea can worship sea gods and like animal gods that are in the sea, like fish, sharks, but in the land they worship like storm gods and gods to do with the weather and fertility for the crops.
Yeah, so exactly. So basically, one would say, look, if you worship, say, let's say, sea gods, because you're a fisherman, and you're a rice farmer in the central Japan, you worship fertility type deities, that suggests the construction of those kami or gods is built upon utility. So basically, a rice farmer needs perhaps fertility gods, or a rice farmer might need to worship basically the weather or the sun. While the fisherman, he has to go into the sea to get his food, therefore he might worship a sea god or protector god. So that shows that, firstly, when we're talking about utility, early tribes had a realization. To survive, you have to be dependent on nature. Yeah? So your survival, early human survival, was dependent on nature. So in nature, you had to build shelter or you would die. In nature, you had to hunt and eat food or you would die. So we have a relationship established. There is a need to live in nature, you have to basically survive. So there is this utility relationship or realization that we are dependent on nature. Now the problem is that nature had this controlling agents within it that had power. So we need to go to the sea and fish, right? We need to fish the food. But the sea is very destructive and we can't control it. We can't control the tide, we can't control the storms. So when we take our fishing boats out into the sea, we're basically purely dependent on nature. Nature could crush us, kill us. So this is why we create these deities and gods around our need. So I need a sea god if I'm going to go out into the sea. I need a fertility god if I'm going to farm. So what we see is that the creation of these gods or divinities or whatever you want to call them is based on an element of utility. And it seems that it evolves as a result. So the rice gods that early Japanese people worshipped never remained rice gods. Why is it in the modern that some of the early gods that started as rice gods changed and become different types of gods, having different powers. Yeah.
Because there wasn't a utility for it. Like all the businessmen worship God who was originally, I think it was a farming god.
Yeah. Anari. So basically, take for example the god Anari, or the kami Anari, started as a kind of rice god, but as human need changed, as we became modern, don't need a rice god. So his kind of powers changed to suit our needs. So we changed the gods to suit our needs, essentially. Any questions there? Okay. So let's look quickly. I didn't mention 2 points in relation to Tyler. So the first point, let's reflect on his statement first. So what is he saying in this statement? If we take a moment to read it, what does he say here? Any ideas what he kind of means? Slightly similar to kind of Spencer. What he's suggesting is that dreams do appear to be significant in the construction of the duality or the distinction between physical and non-physical. Now, for a lot of people that he reflected upon, he suggested that when you're in that community area, when you have dreams, these dreams exist because they're kind of like a supernatural realm, right? So you're kind of connecting to this supernatural reality that's not bound by nature. So what happens when someone dies is that they're revisited by these kind of spirits, entities. So ultimately what happens then is the tribe starts to believe that there is a distinction between the physical and the non-physical, right? And so what happens is there are those people in the tribe that can have more visions of those that are basically, dead, or they can basically access that better. So they're basically these individuals that are the ones that are considered specialists, that basically become the house of dreams. So in essence, what the Zulu believe is that often, let's say for example, you have a dream about your dead father, and he comes and he sends you a warning. So they don't believe that that is obviously imagination. They believe that that is literally their father in spirit form coming back, giving them a warning that they then can act upon. So in essence, all of this relates to that kind of early distinction. Now for Tyler, what he suggests is human beings, though, because he believes animism is the first kind of religious formation. So he says this process helped us realize that there are two components to the human construct: the physical shell and the soul. And that realization then is imbued within all other objects around us. So this might have triggered the creation of the soul and the physical, which we then imbue within all of nature, that we then suggest has an animating force. So the rock, the mountain, has a physical component and the non-physical aspect, the soul that animates it. Are there any questions on that? So one thing that we never talked about is Tyler's methodology, or how did he extract this information? How did he gain these theories? Again, he never went to the field, yeah? Not as bad as Spencer. Spencer's literally an armchair anthropologist. But Tyler, what he does is he basically collects a whole load of documents from missionaries who had gone to different parts of Africa and places and had written what they saw, descriptions of their experiences and the people they met. And so he takes from those missionary documents, he basically tries to kind of understand the social reality, the social world of different tribes, and the Zulu in particular. And so this is where he extracts that basically animism is the first religious system. The problem with all of this is what? So let's say you take your source of evidence, secondary source, you didn't collect it yourself, from, let's say, missionary sources. Why is that problematic?
Because the missionaries already have a concept of the world. The idea of their soul may be different to how the Zulus perceive soul. So it becomes like two levels of separation from the original idea.
Yeah. So they're viewing social reality. So let's say they go from the West to, let's say, parts of Africa, and now you can't switch off your worldview and your perspective. So that will invariably be a bias when you sense and perceive the social realities you encounter. Also, missionaries are going there with a purpose. They're going there to convert, as they see it, the native. So they're looking to convert the native to their kind of sophisticated, rational religion, and they often identify the native religion as irrational, as primitive. So in essence, we're trying to civilize them. So they're going there with this perception that the native is irrational, primitive, and we're going to basically civilize them with things like Christianity. So that's a problem. The whole kind of source material is problematic. But also some of the subjects that Tyler relies on, like James Mumbambe, he's basically been contaminated by Western interaction. So his brother is a Christian convert. So that's also problematic, because now these aren't people that have lived in isolated communities. Now they've been affected by Western modernity and culture and religion. So some of his kind of methodological stuff is problematic. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so moving on to another point that Tyler makes that's an important one, is he suggests and asserts that religion evolved from primitive to sophisticated. Now, how does that occur? How do you go from primitive to sophisticated? So this is an important kind of jump, yeah? Now, firstly, for Tyler, what he suggests is, obviously, the religious system amongst primitive tribes is, again, limited by knowledge, and so it's kind of slightly irrational in some regard. So what he asserts is basically, early tribes, you had the individual and you had nature. Nature, simply put, had power over the individual. They didn't understand how the natural world worked, and they struggled to manipulate nature. So, nature has power over the individual. But what happens when human beings start to develop greater understanding of their natural world? Then what we see is our religion also starts to change. So, for example, early people, when they saw that spark of lightning hit the tree and it burst into flames, they didn't understand what fire is, how is it caused, what is it. They were in awe of it, fear of it. They might have worshipped it as a result. They saw it as this destructive power that we don't know why it exists. But then human beings started to harness fire, manipulate fire, control it. We could actually make fire. We could bring fire into our houses and cook on it and use it. So if there was a divine entity that was basically causing fire, but now we create fire. We're the ones creating it, using it, manipulating it. So here what happens is, in the early stages, human people imbued nature with divinity. But as our understanding grew of nature, what happens is we extract the gods out of nature. So if I'm the one, the human being is the one creating and controlling and manipulating fire, there can't be a divinity within it. So we extract that divinity out, and this is where we become more sophisticated and develop these higher kind of things like heaven and other kind of monistic kind of beliefs. Okay, I know we've run out of time, so I'll leave it there. We'll pick up tomorrow looking at